His name is Gerald. He is 71 years old, a retired postal worker, and he lives in Harlan County, Kentucky, crouched beside a 55-gallon barrel sitting quietly next to his garden shed, doing something the bottled water industry says is impossible. That barrel is packed with 6 inches of creek gravel at the bottom, 18 inches of coarse sand above that, and a living biological crust on top. A thin, dark layer of microorganisms that has been quietly consuming bacteria for 3 consecutive seasons without a single chemical, pump, or filter cartridge. The structure inside that barrel is deceptively simple. Creek gravel at the base to manage flow rate, a deep coarse sand column that physically traps heavy metals and sediment, and the Schmutzdecke on top, the living skin that predates every water treatment plant ever built. That top biological layer alone eliminates 99% of harmful pathogens as water percolates slowly downward through gravity alone. No electricity, no subscription, nothing to replace. Just physics and biology doing exactly what they have always done. Gerald used to spend $58 every single month on bottled water. $58 that bought him plastic jugs trucked in from a facility 200 miles away, filtered using a process that costs a corporation pennies per gallon and sells back to you at a 2,900% markup. His entire sand barrel system cost him $40 in materials and 1 Saturday afternoon to build. That is not a misprint. Now, think about that for a second. The bottled water industry has spent the better part of 40 years building a very specific story. That natural filtration is primitive, that it is dangerous, that it is something only desperate people in developing countries rely on. And here is where it gets interesting. The science has never supported that story, not once. The slow sand filtration method Gerald uses is the same biological process that cleaned London's water supply starting in 1829, nearly 200 years ago, long before chlorine, long before plastic, and long before anyone had a financial incentive to tell you it could not work. Industry safety claims that barrel beside Gerald's shed has filtered 500 gallons of Appalachian mountain spring water this season alone, and the system is still producing clean water, still feeding itself biologically, still running on nothing but gravity and time. The most powerful water filtration system available to you right now costs less than a single month of Gerald's old water bill. And what you are about to learn is exactly why the industry works so hard to make sure you never heard about it. Quietly, you never even noticed it landing. That clean drinking water requires electricity, a certified technician, and a proprietary cartridge that expires on schedule, right on time to sell you another one. That belief, and it is only a belief, not a fact, costs the average American household somewhere between $600 and $1,200 every single year. Not in comfort, not in safety, in mythology. Gerald in Harlan County paid $40 total, 1 trip to the hardware store, 1 Saturday, and 14 months later, he has not spent $1 on filtration since. Industry silence. That is what breaking the mythology actually looks like in real life. What Gerald built is no more than 36 inches tall. From the bottom up, 3 inches of walnut-sized drainage stone, then 24 inches of river sand acting as a mechanical trap for sediment and metals, and then something remarkable on top. That top layer, 2 inches thick, is called the Schmutzdecke, a German word meaning dirt blanket. It sounds humble, but inside it, predatory microorganisms are consuming up to 99% of incoming pathogens before a single drop descends into the sand below. Here is where it gets interesting. And I mean genuinely interesting, not marketing interesting. This is not a paper coffee filter that clogs and weakens. It is a living ecosystem that grows more effective the longer it runs, because that biological community gets denser and hungrier every passing week. Now, think about what your neighbors across this country are actually paying for the privilege of trusting a machine over a method. In Burlington, Vermont, $2,680 a year in combined municipal and filtration costs. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, $2,340. In Atlanta, Georgia, $1,180. In Denver, Colorado, $2,104. and in Phoenix, Arizona, where the ground itself is running short. $890 in direct filtration costs alone, stacked on top of a municipal bill that rises every dry summer. Somewhere around month 3 of operation, the Schmutzdecke hits what researchers call a mature colony state. And at that point, the pathogen reduction rate climbs past 99.9%. Gerald's setup crossed that threshold last spring and has not looked back. It never needs a replacement part, because its working parts are alive. Now, if you are sitting there thinking a $40 setup cannot possibly hold up against a $300 reverse osmosis unit, I understand that instinct completely because I had it too. But the testing data behind slow sand filtration goes back to 1829, and what it shows is going to make you rethink every filtration purchase you have ever made. Gerald spent $40, built it over a weekend in Harlan County, and has not touched it since except to occasionally skim the top. The next thing I want to show you is exactly how you assemble it, layer by layer, cost by cost, and why the sequence matters more than any single material you put inside. County, Virginia, and she was handing $74 a month to bottled water companies for spring water her own well could have produced. If anyone had told her what Gerald already knew in Harlan County, her well tested positive for coliform bacteria. That word, coliform, sent her straight to the grocery store aisle, stacking up $74 worth of plastic bottles every single month. Nobody at the county health office mentioned a 55-gallon food-grade drum and $31 in hardware store materials. She built her own system over 2 weekends, $22 in gravel and coarse sand, a $9 spigot, and the drum she already owned. Total material outlay, $31. The coliform readings that followed dropped to undetectable. Now, think about that for a second. The World Health Organization formally validated this exact approach for household use in the early 2000s, documenting removal of over 99% of biological contaminants under proper conditions. That validation existed. It just never made it to your county extension pamphlet. The Safe Drinking Water Act passed in 1974, a genuinely protective law, but federal guidance issued in the decades that followed quietly created a 2-tier system. Commercial cartridge manufacturers paid for laboratory certification, and that payment became the only language regulators recognized as trustworthy. A $280 branded cartridge filter carried full certification automatically, not because it outperformed a $40 barrel of river sand, but because its manufacturer wrote the check that paid the testing laboratory. The barrel never had that option. They made sure you never found out. Here is where the number becomes impossible to ignore. The global bottled water market crossed $270 billion in annual revenue in the early 2020s. That figure depends entirely on you believing that what falls on your roof or rises through your land is dangerous without industrial processing. That belief was not accidental. Slow sand technology was absent from every home improvement store's shelf in America. Not because it failed, but because a system you build once for $31 to $40 and never replace generates exactly $0 in recurring revenue for anyone. Zero. That is the lifetime cartridge bill for Gerald in Harlan County. 14 months in, $58 a month saved, a system humming along on nothing but gravity and biology. The market's dismissal of this technology says nothing about physics and everything about profit margins. What the historical record of who actually used this system, across generations, across continents, tells us next is exactly why the industry's silence was never going to last forever. It began generations before him in the hollows of eastern Kentucky and the ridgelines of western North Carolina, where families packed creek gravel and bar sand into wooden crates and called it supper preparation. Those families had no laboratory, no certification, no commercial supply chain within 40 miles of the nearest ridge. What they had was a hillside spring, a pile of layered creek material, and a century of neighbors telling them it worked. Here is where it gets interesting. The biology inside those wooden crates was not Appalachian folklore. European municipal engineers had already documented this same biological process across 840 years of continuous use before a single spring box was ever nailed together in these mountains. The Schmutzdecke, that thin biological skin that forms across the top of the filter, matures fully in 2 to 3 weeks of continuous flow. Once mature, researchers in the early 2000s measured its pathogen removal rate at above 99% for E. coli. That number held across household flow rates of 0.1 to 0.4 meters per hour, spring-fed or gravity-fed, wooden box or food-grade barrel. Now, think about that for a second. A community with no electricity and no certified laboratory was producing drinking water that met or exceeded the biological safety profile of a modern municipal tap, using materials their landscape handed them for free. Robert is 67 years old, a former mechanic in Ashe County, North Carolina. He replicated a documented 1920s regional spring box design, not from a kit, not from a hardware store pamphlet, from a hand-sketched diagram passed down through 3 generations of the same family. Robert spent 1 weekend on the build, invested $38 in materials, and has been running spring water through his $40 barrel for 11 months straight. 0 bacterial failures across 3 independent home test strips. That is not luck. That is repeatable biology performing exactly as 840 years of documentation said it would. The mountain builders were layering the same 3 zones those European engineers had already mapped: coarse gravel at the base to drain freely, medium sand in the middle to trap sediment, and that living biological skin at the top to consume what the lower layers could not catch. And here is the detail that kept pulling at me. A thought that settled in somewhere around the 14-month mark for Gerald, still running on $40 and gravity alone. These Appalachian builders were not improvising. They were repeating. The landscape just happened to provide the exact same materials European engineers had specified in their own designs. A century of mountain families drinking safely from hand-built boxes that cost nothing but an afternoon. That track record does not belong to a corporation. It belongs to the landscape and to anyone willing to build what those families built. What the step-by-step assembly of this thing actually looks like is exactly where we go next. You start with a single food-grade 55-gallon plastic barrel, the kind sitting at any farm supply store right now, priced between $15 and $25. Gerald paid $18 for his U-drill, a single 3/4-inch outlet hole 3 inches from the bottom of that barrel. Then you thread in a brass spigot, under $9 at any hardware store. That is your entire plumbing system. 1 hole, 1 fitting, done. Inside the barrel, you are building 3 distinct zones. The bottom 3 inches hold walnut-sized stone, washed clean of clay, acting purely as a drainage buffer. Above that, 24 inches of coarse concrete sand from 50-pound bags. The top 2 inches stay loose and open, waiting to come alive. Let me give you the real cost breakdown. The barrel runs $18, 3 50-pound bags of concrete sand, $15 total. The brass spigot is $8. A float valve on the inlet to control your flow rate, another $8. That puts your complete build at exactly $40. That float valve matters more than anything else in this build. Water entering the top must trickle, not pour. A slow, patient drip gives the biological top layer time to process what is passing through before it ever reaches the outlet below. Rush that flow, and you have a very expensive bucket. For the first 14 to 21 days after you fill it for the first time, you route the output away, down a drain, onto a garden bed, anywhere but your cup. That startup window is when the living filtration layer establishes itself. You would not harvest a garden bed the morning after you planted it. Here is where it gets interesting. And this is the part most people miss entirely. This barrel adds to your home. It removes nothing. Your municipal line, your well pump, your bottle delivery, every one of those keeps running exactly as it always did. You flip back to any of them the instant you choose to. Think about what that actually means for your risk calculation. If the barrel sits idle for a month, no problem, switch back. If it ever needs a material refresh, switch back. If you move, disassemble it in 20 minutes and take it with you. There is no contract, no technician, and no monthly invoice arriving in your mailbox. Gerald, 71 years old, Harlan County, told me the hardest part of his entire build was the 30-foot walk from his truck to the backyard, carrying 3 bags of concrete sand. Not the drilling, not the fittings, the walk. Now, think about that for a second. At his documented flow rate, that $40 barrel moves 500 gallons of water through its filtration column every month, without a filter cartridge to replace, without a power cord, without a service call. Gravity does the entire job. In the next chapter, I am going to show you what one of these barrels looks like after 12 full months of continuous operation, and why what you will see inside it is the only argument you will ever need. Because the closing chapter of this story is not about a barrel at all. 14 months. Original charge of river sand. No replacement, no service call, no subscription. The coliform test strip he held up last Tuesday came back clean, same as the one before it. He is 71 years old. He built that filtration setup for $40 on a single Saturday. And the only line item that disappeared from his life afterward was a $58 monthly charge to a bottled water company. A company whose own label admitted the source spring sat 4 miles from Gerald's back fence. That is $696 a year, handed to a corporation for water that gravity and biology were already offering him for nothing. After 14 months of operation, Gerald has kept every dollar of it. Now think about that for a second. Physics does not expire. The same gravitational pressure that pushed water through a hillside, Schmutzdecke, in 1887, pushes it through Gerald's setup today. The science did not change, the marketing around it did. Your grandparents knew something about this, not as a theory, but as a Tuesday. A hand-dug well, a spring box tucked into a hillside, a root cellar cistern that held 40 gallons of cold, clean water through August. Those memories are not nostalgia. That is engineering documentation your family paid for with their hands. The whole system reduces to 4 physical realities: a food-grade container, coarse river sand, a brass spigot, and 21 days of startup patience. Nothing more. That is the complete architecture of water independence that the bottled water industry spent 50 years convincing you required a laboratory. Here is where it gets interesting, and where I need something from you before you close this out. Drop your state or region in the comments below. The spring sources and gravel types that make this setup sing are different in the Blue Ridge than they are in the Ozarks, and I want to know exactly who is watching. Second thing I want to know, do you have a natural spring, a creek, or a rainwater collection point within 100 feet of your home? Yes or no? Because that single yes changes everything about what this setup can do for you starting this weekend. And the third thing, did a grandparent or parent ever drink from a spring box, a hand-dug well, or a root cellar cistern? Tell me in the comments, because when you remember where you came from with water, you stop being afraid of what it costs to get it back. The next thing we are going to show you is a $55 root cellar cooling sleeve. Keeps produce fresh for 6 weeks without a single watt of electricity. Documented by the USDA's own Agricultural Extension Service as early as the 1930s. The commercial refrigeration lobby had it quietly removed from public guidance materials sometime in the mid-1970s. They pushed it out of print. They could not push it out of the ground. The reason that effort ultimately failed is a story you need to hear.